Alright guys, what is up? In today's video, I'm going to show you how to tune MAF sensor scaling using Romraider and ECU flash for Subarus. The method I'm going to be using is also applicable for tuning MAF sensor scaling on any vehicle. So if you want to learn how to do that, stay tuned. So before we get started on the video today, I'd like to ask you guys to go to my website, swspeedco.com. Go check out all the products that I'm selling. I have high quality 3D printed car parts and tools, as well as t-shirts. So I would really appreciate it if you guys would check that out. So if you haven't seen the Tuning Through the Stages series, I will put a playlist up here so you can go check out all those videos. But the car is currently at stage 4 right now, which is kind of a made up stage. I just called it that to keep it consistent with the way other people market Subaru modifications. But it's, you know, fully built. It's got turbo, header, downpipe. Basically it's full bolt-on at this point. This is kind of the performance package that the car is going to stay at. This is where I'm considering it done as far as engine modifications and performance and stuff. This is where I'm going to spend the time to get the tune very dialed in so that it runs perfectly. So in this video, I'm going to show you the first step of that process, which is getting the MAF sensor scaling dialed in. So I had some people on the previous video I made of getting a base tune setup. I had some people request that I go through the Bad Noodle Tuning Guide. So instead of making one big video where I go through the whole entire guide, I'm just going to break it up into the sections of the tuning guide. So since today we're doing MAF sensor scaling, I'm going to just read that section of the MAF sensor scaling and go over it, and then we'll get into the tuning, and I'll do that for the timing and the boost and all that stuff to kind of just break it up and, you know, make it make more sense. If we come to the guide here, there's like basically two sections of the guide. There's like a research section at the top, and then there's like the actual tuning section. So the research section, it just tells you how the system operates and how it, you know, determines values and basically the ECU's logic of operating. If you want to learn more about how cars determine AFR and how they reach targets and how they operate, you can read through this section. It's page 14 to page 16 about MAF sensor scaling and the fuel and air ratio relationships. So to just kind of briefly summarize what this goes over in this guide here, your stoichiometric air fuel ratio is 14.7 to 1 for gasoline, which is 1 lambda. And lambda is just the percentage off stoichiometric. So if you're at 0.7 lambda, you're 30% rich. If you're 1.3 lambda, you're 30% lean. 1 is stoichiometric. But 14.7 to 1 is the like most optimal range for performance and emissions and all that stuff. But you can't stay at that mixture the entire time. You have to change it if you're increasing load. So 14.7 is what the car targets when you're just cruising and you're in closed loop fueling. Closed loop fueling, it's reading feedback from the narrowband O2 sensor, and it's adjusting the fueling and the pulse width based on the amount of air coming in through the engine that is picked up by the MAF sensor. And it's adding the correct amount of fuel for the amount of air that's coming in, and it's reading the O2 sensor's output, and it's adjusting the amount of fuel coming in to keep the engine running at stoichiometric. That's essentially closed loop fueling, very simplified. But when you give it some gas and you put it under some load and you want it to build boost pressure, you need to have a more stable air fuel mixture that's not going to pre-detonate. What we need to do for that, we need to add more fuel to the air to make the mixture more stable and less volatile. A good safe number, if you're running a top mount intercooler, this says 10.5 to 1 to 11 to 1. I like to run 11 to 1, and I have no issues with that. And then if you have a front mount intercooler, you can do 11 to 11.5. To reach those values, the car enters open loop, where it's basically ignoring what the O2 sensor is saying, and it's going solely off the MAF sensor scaling and the fueling table to determine what fuel ratio you want to run. So this is why MAF sensor scaling is a very important thing to tune, because it determines the air fuel ratio that your car is running at when in open loop fueling. So you want to make sure that's tuned correctly so you're not running too rich or too lean. So this also talks about closed loop to open loop delay, and the factory closed loop to open loop delay system and transition. It's really hard to get it to transfer into open loop fueling, and that's probably because of emissions. Keeping it in closed loop fueling, keeping it at stoic for as long as possible will yield the best emissions, but it creates kind of like hesitation when you're getting into the throttle, because it's like taking longer to go down to the air fuel ratio you need it to be at. If you watched the previous video, I showed you how to change that delay to 0 and then also change the RPMs in which it will switch to that delay to a lower RPM, so it'll enter open loop fueling very quickly. So I can talk on that again in this video, or you could go check out the previous video. And then right here in the guide, it tells you the logic and operating system of how it determines your air fuel ratio. So that's pretty interesting to note as well. So if we come down to page 23 on this guide, this is where it starts talking about actually tuning the car. This is the order right here in which you're supposed to be tuning your car. So you can see number 1 on here is establishing your air and fuel relationship. So we do that by doing the MAF scaling. So these things are kind of what I was talking about in setting up a base tune. If you've changed a lot on the car, so setting wastegate duty cycle to 0 so that you run wastegate base pressure. And then I don't make it run rich. I don't do that. I think doing the wastegate duty cycle and the timing is enough. So I do those two, but I don't really mess with the fueling table. I just keep it at 11:1. So this section, it talks about, so if you have a stock intake, but you put big injectors on it, your fueling is going to be off. But if you change the injectors, you need to tune injector scaling and injector latency, but you don't touch the MAF scaling because you didn't change anything with the MAF housing. So that's not where your issues are coming from. We're not talking about injector flow scaling right now. We're going to do MAF scaling, but it's something to mention. If you have a aftermarket intake and you also have new injectors, it's really difficult to tune both of them at the same time. So if it is possible, it's best to put like a stock intake on it and then tune the injector scaling. And then once the injector scaling is tuned, then you could put the aftermarket intake on there and then tune the MAF sensor scaling to the aftermarket intake. Tuning them at the same time is kind of tricky. Now, if that's not an option and you have to tune it with the bigger injectors and the bigger intake at the same time, the best way to go about that is to take your manufacturer's values that they give you when you purchase the injectors. There should be like a spreadsheet that has the values here, like this one for Dishworks 1200cc injectors, and it gives you all these values here for your latencies and your flow rates. A good starting point is just to input those values and then tune the MAF scaling for any discrepancies after that. But the ideal situation is that you tune them separately. So this guide goes over how to tune the injector flow scaling and the injector latency. But down here is where we start talking about MAF scaling. This doesn't go into too much like detail onto how to do the MAF scaling. It basically just says to use the Romraider MAF tool. I made a video about MAF scaling a few years ago, and I use the Romraider tool, and it works really good, but it takes a long time to get it tuned using that method. So I have kind of a new way that I do it as well. So basically with the MAF tool, you just drive around on the freeway for like 30 minutes and you try to keep your gas pedal foot like pretty steady. Like you can add more gas or let off. You just want to do it very slow so you're not doing like quick throttle changes. And you just drive around on the freeway for like 30 minutes and you try to get the MAF voltage through as wide of a range as possible without going into open loop fueling. And it just plots the fuel correction values on a scatter plot. Then you could put like a line of best fit on the scatter plot, and it shows you in the different voltage ranges how much fuel correction it's making. And then from those fuel corrections, you can adjust the MAF sensor scaling in those ranges. And then you do that a couple times, rinse and repeat, and then you get it to where it's within 5% plus or minus. But that can take multiple days, lots of hours. So I started doing it a different way, and I'll show you how I do that. All right, so we got the new intake on the car. Now we're going to start the beginning steps of the tuning process. What I like to do first is just start the car with the existing tune. We're gonna start it, see what kind of corrections it's making, and then turn it off, and we'll make like a kind of a broad across the board correction based on like what percentage correction the car is making. And then we'll reflash that tune on the car. And then I'm going to data log the cold start, because when it cold starts, there's more load on the engine. So you get into this range. So there's certain areas of the mass airflow sensor voltage that are hard to get when you're cruising. So you have like an idle range, which is like between 1.1 to 1.4 depending on your car. And then when you're cruising, it's hard to get below 1.9. So you have this like gap between like 1.4 and 1.9 where it's really hard to fill in the MAF scaling for that area. And you can kind of just like keep the curve the same between that area, and that should be fine. But what I like to do is I like to log the cold start, because the cold start puts enough load on it that it gets it in that like 1.8 to 1.4 range. So you can record what it's doing in that range and then make those changes in that area from the cold start. So we're gonna be logging AF correction. That's like short-term fueling corrections that the computer is making. AF learning is long-term corrections that the ECU is making. Then we have the wideband O2 sensor, which is wired into my TGV deletes. I'll try to make a video on how to do that in the future. But for this MAF scaling tuning, it's pretty important to have a wideband O2 sensor. So if you don't have one, I would recommend getting one because it kind of limits your ability to tune the wide open throttle area, because the stock O2 sensor, it's actually a narrow band O2 sensor and it only reads down to 11:1. So if you want to get an accurate tune, you got to get a wideband O2 sensor. Then we're going to be logging engine load because some of the graphs use engine load as a reference, so I like to log that one. Engine speed, that's RPM, that's important to know as well. Feedback knock corrections, just so we can see if anything bad's happening. Same with the knock sum, that's just there to so we can keep track of that. The final fueling base, this is what the fuel map is telling the car to target. Fine learning knock correction is learned correction. So the feedback knock correction is like instantaneous correction, and then if you're having knock in the same spot all the time, it's going to learn that correction. So that's another good thing to log. Obviously, we're going to want to measure the mass airflow and the mass airflow sensor voltage so we can correlate our corrections to a certain mass airflow sensor voltage. And that's about it for what we're going to need. I might add a couple things on here at some point, but for now, this is all we need. I'm going to go ahead and start the car, and then we will let the idle settle out, and then we'll start logging. So let's start the car. All right. So it's not doing any corrections, and I think it's because it's in open loop fueling right now. But if we watch my wideband O2 sensor here, it's bouncing pretty lean down to like 1.2. So if you saw that, it's bouncing between 1.15 lambda and 1.2 lambda or 1.25 lambda. So it's running lean, which is what we would expect. I'm going to go into the tune, and across the board, I'm going to start on the low end. We don't want to overshoot what we're targeting. I'm going to change the MAF scaling by 15%, and then we'll reflash the car and try this again. All right, so coming back to my tune here. Sorry if the camera angle's bad. This is going to be an unflattering camera angle, but it's what we're working with here. I'm going to highlight until 2.89 because that's when you switch over to open loop fueling from my experience. We're going to highlight everything from 2.89 all the way down to 0.90, as low as it goes. And then since the car was running lean, we need to increase the scalar value, because this value is telling it this is how much air is coming into the engine, and it's adding the amount of fuel for that amount of air, but it's running lean because it's not adding enough fuel because it thinks there's less air than there is. So we need to increase that scalar value to tell the car that there's more air and it knows the appropriate amount of fuel to add. So we're going to highlight those values. We'll click edit. It will come to multiply data. And the reason I like lambda is because you've seen the output number it gave me was 1.15. So I can take that number, and that's exactly a percentage. So I don't have to do any extra math with trying to figure out the percentage from 14.7 it's off to figure out how to multiply my data. So I can just see that it's 15% lean and just multiply it by 15%. So I want to increase these scalar values by 15%. I can multiply it by the lambda we were seeing. So if I multiply this by 1.15, it's going to increase the values by 15%. And there we go. Change the values. Call that good for now. We're going to reflash the car. These connectors are hard to plug in. I'm thinking about designing a adapter so you can plug these connectors into a button, so it's easier to do that. So if you'd be interested in something like that, let me know. I think I'm going to design it in the near future, whether that be a popular sale item or not. Okay, so green connectors are plugged in. First step of flashing the ECU. Now, you want to make sure you have the correct ROM you want to flash opened. And you see this little thing with the red arrow down. It says write currently loaded ROM image to ECU's flash memory. So we're going to click on that button. Okay, and then it's going to tell you to turn the ignition on and press OK. And we'll let it flash. Okay, and then once it's flashed, you just turn off the ECU, press OK, and we'll unplug these green connectors. Okay, those are unplugged. So now we can try it again. Okay, I'm gonna give this another go. Let's see what we're running at here. Okay, so I'm gonna put it into closed loop and open loop fueling mode so we can see that it's in 7. That means, I think it's warm up is what 7 means. So that's why we're not seeing any corrections. We can see it's much closer to our target now. It's only going 5 to 10% lean instead of 20 to 25. So that's pretty close. So I'm gonna record the warm up to just record the final fueling base, basically, wideband O2 sensor. So we'll start this and we're just gonna let the car warm up and just monitor and make sure everything goes fine. Okay, so now we can see it's starting to make corrections and we can monitor what corrections it's making. Now it's in 8. 8 means it's in closed loop fueling. It's reading the O2 sensor and referencing the fuel map. So now we can see that our wideband O2 sensor is running at stoichiometric now. It's running at 1, but we're seeing a 3% positive correction. So we're still not dialed in perfectly. Your goal is gonna be 1 to 5%. And you've seen how I made a 15% change instead of a 25% change? That's because the different ranges are gonna have different correction values. It's not gonna be the same across the whole board. So that's why I didn't wanna make a 25% change, because while that would work in the 1.5 volt range, at idle, it would be running too rich now. So you wanna make kind of the small end of the changes and then, you know, kind of creep up on your target. But as it gets down to where it's gonna settle out and idle, we'll turn the car off, we'll look at the data log, and we'll see what kind of changes we can make from there, and then we can go drive the car. Okay, so for my data logging, I'm using Megalog Viewer to read my data logs. To get like I think it's like $50 maybe, it might be less, to get the license to use the software. It's definitely worth it because this is way easier than using Excel. Right here on the left, we're doing RPM, knock sum, don't need to worry about that right now. Final fueling base, which is our target. Wideband O2 sensor, is what we're actually reading. And then the mass airflow sensor voltage. So let me add one more thing onto here. We started at 1.54 volts. We are running about 7% lean, 5 to 7% lean. I'll say 5% lean. Looks like once it settles out, it's like 8% lean, around 1.5 volts. Let's see how long it goes around there. And then you can see this is where the closed loop fueling kicks in and we start having AF corrections. So we can't look at the raw final fueling base and wideband O2 sensor values. But we can see from 1.5 to 1.4, we're still 7% lean, but I think the correction I will make for that is gonna be probably 6%. I think will be a safe start. I'm not gonna make any changes yet. I'm just gonna select my area just so I remember. So it's right there. So you can see right here, this is where we made our big percentage change. You don't want your MAF graph to look like this because this is gonna make it run awful. You want your graph to keep a nice smooth curve. We'll keep that in mind as we're doing this tuning. We don't wanna make too broad of changes, but I'm noticing at some point it switches to being more close to like 4% to 3% lean, which I think is right here. So around 1.31 volts, it goes from being like on average 7% lean to being 4 to 5% lean. We're gonna update our selection here. So I'm gonna select from 1.33 to 1.56, and we're going to click edit, multiply data, and we're gonna do 1.06. We're doing rough corrections right now, so I don't wanna go all the way to what the target is. We wanna just kinda ease up on it so we don't overshoot. We're gonna add 6% for starters. Enter, so that'll shift up. And then let's go back to our log. I'm gonna click through this some more. So it looks like from 1.29 to 1.26, where we're settling in an idle, it's only doing about 2 to 3% correction. So I'm just gonna multiply those values by 2% all the way down to the base. So edit, multiply data 1.02, and then that should get us in the range of between plus or minus 3%. Is the goal we're looking for here. Now, just to double check, we're gonna make sure our graph is still smooth. The resolution at these low MAF voltages are pretty good, so the graph does stay pretty smooth. The only thing I might wanna change is maybe this transition here. 1.3 to 1.25, I'll select that and go to edit and interpolate vertically, and that will make this value in the middle of those, so it kind of smooths that transition. At 1.56, we were seeing a 7% correction. I ended up doing a 6% correction. We're gonna select from 1.64 up to 2.89, and we're going to do an additional 6% preemptively, because I think if that's what we were seeing, that the cruise might be in that area as well. We'll select those, edit, multiply data, 1.06. Okay, so bump that up. So now our graph is smooth. Except right here, we did a total correction of 15% and then 6%. I'm gonna start with just a 15% correction in this top range, because if you do too much correction, you can start to run pretty rich. So I might even do a 10% correction. So I'll just select everything from 3 to 5, edit, multiply data, 1.10. Okay, so I'm gonna select 2.7 to 3.12. And we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna hit interpolate vertically, and it'll smooth out that little jump there. So this is still not perfectly smooth, but this is fine to work with and get started on this tuning. So now this should be in the ballpark for cruising. Wide open throttle, we're not even messing with that yet. But this should be in the ballpark for cruise. So what we're gonna do now is go tune the cruising. But before we start that, so there's a couple ways you can do MAF scaling tuning. You can come into Romraider, and down here there's a little MAF tab. So you can click record data and you drive around, you try to keep the throttle opening angle smooth, and you don't do any like abrupt changes to throttle. Go cruise on the freeway, and it'll populate points through here at different MAF voltages, and it'll tell you like the percent correction, and then you can make those correction changes into your MAF scaling table and then rinse and repeat. But from my experience, it takes probably like 4 to 5 times to get a really nice dialed tune. A way that I've found to do it that's a bit faster is without relying on the computer's corrections to make our decisions. We can just disable the computer's corrections and just purely look at the wideband O2 sensor readout and the final fueling base and make changes directly from that. And we can use brake boosting to change our load ranges. So what I like to do is disable closed loop fueling. It's just going off the fueling table, but it's not, there's no feedback or correction. It's just running straight off what the fuel table says. And then I'll go on a long straight road and just, you know, be cruising in like 3rd gear and start at like low load, low mass airflow sensor voltage. And then I'll just slowly apply the brakes to make that load go up, and I'll apply more gas, more brake to get it all the way to 2.8. It'll give you like a graph of the how much it's off from your target, and then you can make those changes. It takes maybe, you know, if you're efficient, you can probably get this tuned out in an hour, versus the other method, you have to do like 4 or 5 30-minute cruising sessions to get that data. So the way I do it is a bit faster. So in order to disable that is you need to come to your primary open loop fueling table here, and you see how all these values say 14.7. So we're gonna change those equal to 14.6. Okay, we're gonna change it to 14.6. So any value that equals 14.7, we're gonna change to 14.6. So now that all those are changed, we can close this out. And then there's gonna be another table right here in the fueling primary open loop category, and it's called minimum active primary open loop enrichment. So when you click on that value, it'll activate primary open loop fueling when the fuel table has a value that's richer than 14.41. So since we changed those down to 14.6, we will change this to 14.65. So now when there's a value richer than 14.65, it'll be an open loop fueling. So this effectively disables closed loop fueling. So it's always just gonna be an open loop fueling. Okay, so that should disable it. So we can go back and flash this onto the car and then go and do the driving test. So I thought of something else worth noting. When you first flash your car, especially if your tune needs some work still, the car will like stall when you put the clutch in sometimes. So the best way to address that is just to start the car, don't touch the gas, anything, and just let it idle for like 10 minutes, and it kind of figures itself out, and then it should keep you from stalling when you put the clutch in. It usually happens to me every time I reflash the car, no matter how good the tune is. Sometimes it just needs to figure itself out before it'll start driving correctly. So the best way to do that is just let it idle for a little bit, figure itself out, and then start driving it. So before we start doing the cruising tuning, I wanted to just go over something real quick. So we got the tune roughed out, so the actual value shouldn't be too far off of what they need to be. It should be fine to drive around without the fuel correction. It should drive fine, even if it's a little rich or a little lean. But if you're still kind of unsure about it, you can still tune it with the corrections enabled. It's just gonna probably take a little more time, be a little bit more confusing. You could also run through the other method I showed you, do that like once, and that'll get it really close to being roughed out, and then do this method. And I could put a card up here to the video I made where I did it with the other method, and you can see that method in action and then see this method. So you can do the MAF scaling tool on Romraider and then go do this method, and that'll work a lot faster than just using the Romraider method on its own. So we're going to get the car started with the closed loop fueling disabled. So right now we're running at 1.5 to 1.6 lambda, so we're running a little lean at idle. I'm gonna let this settle out, and then I'm gonna do a log of, sometimes your air fuel ratio will bounce around a bit. Even within 5%, plus or minus 5% is okay, but I like to try to target plus or minus 3%. So the idle's actually looking pretty good right now. The idle's teetering around like 1 to 1.3, 1.03. So it's within spec, and you can see on the screen here, closed loop open loop fueling status is at 7. It's gonna stay at 7, and we're not gonna see any corrections here in the AF learning or AF corrections. We can go drive around and see if we can get this ironed out. I'm hoping you guys can hear me okay. I'm gonna yell so you guys can hear me. We're on a straight road. I'm gonna put it in second gear, start recording. Okay, then we're gonna get up to like 3,000 RPMs. Some nice easy throttle control. So right now we're at 1.8. So I'm going to put my foot on the brake and slowly apply gas to try to slowly change that load value. So now we're at 2.1, 2.16, 2.18, and I'm just slowly applying more gas to increase the load. But I'm trying to do it steady so it doesn't like jump around a bunch. I'm gonna find an area in the log where it's smooth. So like if we go to the left here, you can see it's all choppy. We don't really want that. It can create some inconsistencies. So I'm gonna come over to the area where it's smooth, and we can see in green our mass airflow sensor voltage is 1.87. So that's what we're gonna be starting. We can see it's 5.25% lean. So this little AFR error thing, it's a calculated field. So if I go up here and click calculated fields, custom fields, you can add a custom field and you can put like an equation in based on what like tables you're logging. So the formula for this AFR error is the wideband O2 sensor divided by the final fueling base minus 1, and then you times that by 100, and that gives you a percentage. So it tells you the percentage it's off. So that value is in there, so I can monitor how it's off without having to do too much math. But you can also just look. It's pretty easy with Lambda. 0.99 is the target, it's at 0.04, so we're 5% too lean. So we're gonna go through the MAF sensor voltage and see if there's any areas where there's more or less. So right now I'm seeing 5%, and let's see if it's across the board. So let's just walk through this. 6, 5, 6, 5, 6, 5. So we're bouncing between 6 and 5, and then it looks like as we get up to 1.94, we're getting more correction. So I'm gonna go find out where that jump is. So it looks like right at 1.9 is where it jumps. So let's go into our table, pull up our MAF sensor scaling from 1.9, from 1.88 to 1.9. We don't have much resolution here. We're running 5 to 6% lean. So I'm going to select 1.8. The last selection we edited to was 1.56 because that's what the cold start was at. So I'm going to select to that value, and we're going to click edit, multiply data, 1.05. Okay, now let's go back to our thing, and now we're at 1.9, and we're going to see what the average correction is. So 7, 8, 11. So 1.9 to, it looks like 2.3. We're seeing like 6 to 7, and then it jumps up to like 11. So I think we're gonna go, we'll select 1.9 to 2.3, and we're going to edit, multiply data, 1.06. We'll start with 6. Actually, we'll do 7. I'm just gonna keep working through this in that same way. Say, okay, so now we're at 2.4, and we're at 11, 10, 9, 10, 11, 10, 10, 9. So we're averaging 10. So let's see how far the 10 goes before it changes. 9, 10, 9, 10, 9, 10, 9, 10, 8, 9, 8, 9, 8, 9. Okay, so it changed a little bit. So let's see where it changed. So there's our last 10 at 2.18. Back to our MAF scaling table. So 2.1 to 2.18, those two, and we're gonna do edit, multiply data, 1.1. So that's 10%. And I'm not too worried about the smoothness at this point. I'm just trying to get the values in there, and then once the values are in there, I can adjust, do fine adjustments to make it smooth. 2.18, it switches. So now we're between 8 and 9. 7, 7, 8, 7, 8, 7, 8. Okay, now we dropped again. So let's go back where it switches, and we're gonna do 7 here. Okay, 2.44. So now I'll go back, 2.23 to 2.42, 2.44, around there. And we're gonna click edit, multiply data, 7%, so 1.07. Enter. So now we're 5, 6, 5, 6, 5, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 7, 6. Okay, and this is when we came to the stop. So we got up to 2.56, and we were about 7% lean. Okay, let's wait till we get to the next one. So tentatively 2.54 is the next value we're gonna modify, and it's gonna be about 7%. Okay, get back up and moving. It was choppy. Try to smooth it out. Okay, 2.54, back where we left off. We're looking at 6, 5. So it looks like there's like possibly an area in between that is lower. So we had like a dip right there, so I'm not gonna count that, but 7. Okay, so that bumps up. So 6.3, 6.2. Between 5.4 and 6.6, I'm going to multiply data by 5, 1.05%. Enter. Now we're looking for the next group. we're around 6 to 7%, 6% up until like 1.7, and then it jumps up to 7. So I think for this, just this one value, 2.77, I'm going to multiply by 1.06. So we did 2.7, so 2.89 to 3. I'm gonna do multiply data 1.09. So we'll bump that up 9%. So now we can see our graph curve right here, and I can see areas where it's not smooth. Everything down here looks real good, real nice and smooth, and then there's a little area right here that's not smooth. So I need to figure out what point that is, and there's no real other good way of doing it other than counting them. So here's 2. So this is 2.03. 2.11, 2.19, and 2.23. So I'm going to select 2.23, and if we go up to edit, you can see increment and decrement are the brackets. So I'm going to not worry about what the value is. I'm just going to hit increment until I see it be smooth. So watch that dot. Do you see how it popped up there? I'll hit it a couple more times. It's smooth. Where's our next issue? It's like right over here. So this is where we're transferring into wide open throttle. 3.01. I think we're about where we need to be. So let's select 3.1225, and we're going to increment till it's smoothish. I don't want to go all the way up. Okay, I think that's good for now. So there's still a little dip, but it's not, we didn't increase it too much. So I'm afraid it's going to be really rich, but I think this will be a good starting point. And we can flash this on. We're going to double check the cruise again and make sure things are where they need to be. So I'm going to flash this onto the car. We're going to go do the same thing again and just confirm our results. Alright, so I'm going to go back and look at the data logs, but from what I could tell so far, it's dialed in perfectly. It's within 3%. I would even say plus or minus 1.5%. Like, it's really close. And right now you can look at the idle, and the idle is bouncing around 1.01, 1.2, 1.0. It's pretty dialed in right now. So I think this is going to be it. So I'm just going to go over it real quick and make sure everything's good, but I think we're about done here. So let's open up the new one. Open, yes. Smoothed out. Okay, so we're at 2.08. We're right on 1. So the AFR correction says the final fueling base is 0.9, and the targets, or what we're getting, is 1. That's perfectly fine. So we're within 1%. If we can go through this whole thing and it's within 3%, it's pretty much dialed. So there was a little bit of a high spot where it was lean for a second, but it was still within 3% right here, I think. Yeah, so it went lean just for a second. The other thing is too, if it's a blip like that where it's like between 2.6 and 2.8, it's like we can't really change that unless there's like an exact like point that corresponds. The change is between these 2 points, so I can't adjust for that error without messing up the smoothness of the curve. Small points like that you don't really want to worry about too much. Your main goal is to get it good for pretty much everything, and then when you turn the corrections back on, when you turn closed loop fueling back on, the car will make the rest of the corrections. And as long as it's within 3%, everything's good. 3%, 2.5, 3, 2.5. Okay, then towards the end there, started to get a little higher. So we might need to do this one more time. I think I can shave some fat off of this. After 2.28, I'm seeing it's about 2% lean and it doesn't really go rich. What we can do is we can go, so up until, let's say 2.52, we're going to add 2%. And I think that'll be a good move. We'll do 2.34 to 2.54. Okay, so we'll hit edit. We'll do multiply data, 1.02. Okay, so it shifted that up. So now 2.66. I don't think we got up that high, but at about 2.56, it starts going more lean. Let's see what I got up to in the next one. 2.6. Okay, so this one's reading differently. So I think it's just as it starts targeting lower than 1 is when the correction starts to get more. Up until 2.6, it's about 2. So that's why it's good to do it multiple times so you can like cross-reference and make sure the results you're seeing are accurate. I'm gonna select these guys. I'm gonna select from 2.6 all the way up. We're gonna do an additional 2% here, 1.02. So we basically, everything from 2.34 and up, we added another 2% of air, so to make it go more rich. The same thing I did just now, I'm just gonna do it again, make sure everything's nice and smooth. So that's gonna do it for this video. If you stayed to the end, I really appreciate it. Wide open throttle MAF scaling is gonna be the next video, so stay tuned for that video. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you'll get notified when that video comes out. Go check out swspeedco.com and take a look at some of the 3D printed car parts and tools that I have, as well as t-shirts that I sell. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you have any questions for me, leave them down in the comments below. If you aren't subscribed, please consider subscribing. And if you know of somebody who might like this video, please share it with them. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Peace.